Feel the magic.
What a play.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Alec Torelli. Welcome to Conscious Poker and another episode of the Hand of the Day. This hand kicks off from the Hustler live stream, playing 100, 200 blinds with a $200 ante. And Brian Kim, really good, solid pro, opens in the cutoff to 1,000. Pretty standard open here. He's got two kings, wants to make a big open, pretty normal. And folds over to Bill Klein in the big blind, who has ace-king offsuit. And instead of re-raising, like most people would do here, I think $5,000 re-raise is pretty standard. He probably doesn't want to play a big pot out of position with a hand that doesn't always flop a pair. He doesn't know what to do post-flop, and he doesn't know what to do, but not a great spot post-flop. If you miss, you're out of position against a really good solid pro. So he decides to be tricky and just call. And we go heads up to the flop. Flop comes 10-5-4 with 5-4 hearts. Bill Klein checks and flow over to Brian, who goes ahead and makes a 2/3 pot bet, making it 1,600. Pretty standard here. Over to Bill Klein, who now has a pretty easy call. I mean, if you're going to flat with ace-king pre, you kind of have to call the flop. You have two overs. You might have the best hand. Not loving this spot, but at least have to call here and see the turn. So he calls, and we go to the turn. Turn comes another 5. Really not changing anything. If Bill Klein had the best hand, he still does. He goes ahead and checks over to Brian Kim once more. And Kim now puts out a pretty big bet here. He's betting 4,000 into this pot of just over 5,000. So basically saying, look, I have a pretty strong hand. When Brian bets this turn here, he's going to have hands like a 10 or better. Otherwise, he has air. He's not going to be betting this turn with pocket eights, at least for this sizing. And if he has a 10, he probably doesn't even have something like Jack 10. He probably has a pretty strong 10, maybe like King 10, Ace 10, or Jacks plus. Otherwise, he has a 5, a boat, or he has air, maybe something like 6, 7, or just a complete stone bluff. Maybe he has Queen Jack or something like that, or he has a flush draw. Those are probably his most common bluffs, straight draw or a flush draw. So when he bets this big, it's a bet that basically says, look, I have a pretty damn strong hand, otherwise I'm bluffing. Back over to Bill Klein here, who at this point, facing those two types of hands from Brian, that range of hands from Brian that's either really strong or nothing, is not in a great spot. I mean, yes, he has ace-king high, and he might have the best hand, but if he is behind, he's going to be in very bad shape, right? If Brian has something like ace 10, Bill Klein's drawing only to a king with one card to go. So the times that Bill Klein is behind, he's going to be very, very far behind. And the times he's ahead, he's pretty far ahead. So it's one of those weird, awkward spots out of position where he kind of underplayed his hand pre-flop. And now he finds himself in a kind of awkward spot on the turn where, in a way, his hand is kind of underrepresented, but at the same time, he still only has a pure bluff catcher. So in this spot, against a good player, out of position, probably would let this go, but I really can't blame him for calling once more here. One thing to note about his call on the turn is that his body language, his posture, you see him kind of putting in chips there kind of hesitantly and just kind of dropping in that one chip. It's not that strong. It doesn't look to me, at least observing here, like a call from someone that is trapping with a 5. Now, this is really important because this is going to affect what we think about his hand on the river. But number one, it doesn't look like he's trapping with a 5 just from his body language. Number two, if he had a 5, let's say he had ace 5 or 6-5 suited or something like 5-4 with a boat, a lot of the time he's going to be raising this turn here, right? He's going to bump it up to 15,000, wanting to get value from his hand. Not always, but at least some of the time. So when you add those two things together, it makes it less likely, in my opinion, that Bill has a 5, which will come into play in a minute. Before we get to the river, if you're new here, my name is Alec Torelli, poker player and coach. And on this channel, I break down famous hands of poker to help you make better decisions on your journey. Be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, dropping awesome content here all the time, have been for the past 5 or 7 years. And also, if you head over to consciouspoker.com, I have a free hand reading system that helps you break down how to put your opponents on a range, figure out what they're holding, and make better decisions. It's the exact formula I use and teach to clients and students alike. If you like this style of video and training and my thought process, it's all in a free PDF. Head over to consciouspoker.com or click the link in the description. All right, let's get back to the video. The river comes a 5 of spades, which really doesn't change anything. If Bill has the best hand, he still does. If not, well, he's behind. One thing that makes it less likely, though, is that either player is holding a 5 because now there's 3 5s on the board. Bill decides to now take an awkward, kind of weird, unexpected line here and bet 13,000. I think most of the time here, the default play with ace-king is just to check, simply because if you have the best hand, you could check and let your opponent bluff, and then call and win more money. And if you have the worst hand, when you bet with ace king, let's say your opponent has a 10 or jacks or queens, he's not going to be folding when he has you beat. So the bet is kind of awkward. You have a hand that's in between the types of hands your opponent has, right? When you're behind, you are going to get called by better, and when you're ahead, worse might fold. But the worst part about it, the challenging part about this bet, is if Brian has air, he might now decide to raise you and rep something like aces or kings. So it's a really awkward, kind of weird, unconventional bet. I'm not exactly sure what Bill had in mind, but he was definitely up to something on this river. He had a plan. Okay, so he goes ahead and bets 13,000. Now over to Brian with two kings here. Like, what types of hands is Bill betting 13,000 here with? Is he really have the best hand? Is he betting this way with a 5? I don't know. It's kind of weird to bet with a 5 this way, because if you have a 5, you're hoping your opponent has a 10. You're hoping your opponent has jacks or queens or kings or aces, and you're going to check raise, right? So why would you bet here with a 5? Similarly, why would you bet here with 10s full, right? For the same reason, you're not going to bet with a 5. You're probably going to check 10s full and just hope your opponent bets and go for the check raise. So it's kind of a weird bet. I feel like a lot of this time, if I'm in Brian's shoes, I don't really know what to make of this bet, because it really doesn't make sense for my opponent to be betting this river. It doesn't make sense for him to be betting as a bluff, because all the bluffs missed, and I'm representing a strong hand, so why would he be betting into me? And it also doesn't make sense for him to bet with the nuts. At the same time, I would probably think to myself, you know what? Maybe he has something like a 10 where he's just going for value. He has a full house now. He's like, well, screw it. I got top full house. I'm going to bet. Or he has jacks and he like slow played his jacks pre, and now he wants to get value from a 10 that's going to check behind, or a not, or pocket nines or something like that. And so he just goes ahead and bets. So if I have kings here, I'm pretty much at the top of my range. Like, I have one of the best hands I can have, and I'm going to be raising here. I also would want to bluff this river with king if I had air, because I would want to be able to bluff and get my opponent to fold a 10, because if you're raising here and you're Brian, you're repping better than a 10. So if your opponent has a 10 and he's getting raised on this river, you're like, well, I'm only beating a bluff. Right? So it makes sense to raise with kings. It makes sense for Brian to bluff some of the time. To balance that out, I think raising with kings makes quite a bit of sense here. So he makes it 50,000 with kings, and I like that sizing. I mean, you want to make it a sizing here that you would make it if you're bluffing. Right? You're not going to make it 28,000 on a bluff. It's just too small of a bet. Your opponent's always going to call. So you got to size up here. You got to go big here and make it seem like you could be bluffing to hopefully level your opponent into calling you with a 10. So Brian makes it 50,000 here. I like this move. And now back over to Bill Klein, who obviously has a very clear fold. Or does he? Now he goes back into the tank, and it's like, with ace king, it's almost one of those hands that could maybe even be a call. Like, if Brian's bluffing, ace king beats all of the bluffs, right? Like, let's say Brian has a random missed flush draw, or 6-7, or 6-8, or 8-9, or just like queen jack, and he was just bluffing. Like, ace king still could have the best hand. So perversely, ace king here could even be a weird, awkward call. So Bill goes into the tank. He's actually thinking about it, but then he goes down and reaches for chips. What does he have in mind? Now he goes and makes a huge raise here, putting Brian all in. And this is a pretty crazy play. Like, crazy in a good way. Like, you would not expect anyone, especially someone like, I think with Bill Klein's image, to be bluffing here, right? So this is a play where Bill is basically saying, look, I have a 5. He's basically saying, you know, I have a 5. Maybe he has 10s full. Maybe he didn't 3-bet pre and he just flatted the flop and turn with 10s full. But most of the time he's saying here, I have a 5. And he's in the big blind. He could have had a 5. Like, he could have flatted with king 5 suited, or ace 5 suited, 5-6 suited, 5-7 suited, and just have a 5. So when he jams here, he's basically saying, I have quads. Now, over to Brian, who's debating here with what to do with kings. And I got a lot of comments on Twitter and social media and heard people talk about this hand where they're like, oh, Brian's getting basically 3-1, right? He has to call 77K to win 190K. He needs to be right about 29% of the time, which means Bill needs to be bluffing 29% of the time for Brian to justify calling. And people are like, oh, it's only 77K more. The pot's so big. Why would you fold here? And it's like, look, you know, you guys have played a lot of poker. I played a lot of poker. How many times does someone bet and then 3-bet jam the river with a bluff on this board? Is it really 29%? It's not 29%. I mean, if you're calling here on the river, you're going to see it quads 95% of the time. So Brian's sitting there thinking, well, I have a super strong hand, but I need my opponent to be bluffing nearly 30% of the time to justify calling. People don't bluff here in live games, especially I think someone like Bill Klein with his image aren't bluffing 30% of the time here. right? They're probably bluffing like 5%.
If you're Brian, you just got to think this is a 5 almost all the time. What a bluff from Bill.
This would be a really amazing bluff. 10 out of 10.
It's a crazy spot with, if I'm Brian Kim, I'm thinking like, I just never have the best hand. The guy always has quads. So I don't mind Brian's move here of raising the river and then facing a big jam on the river, probably just going to be like, I guess it's always quads. I mean, Brian could have a 5 too, right? Brian's not immune to having a 5. He can have a 5. He can have 10s full. It's not like it's impossible for him to have a hand that could call the river here. So I think in Brian's spot, I'm probably only calling with quads, maybe 10s full. And you know, I don't even mind him debating here on the river. This is not an easy spot for all the people saying, oh, this is such a slam dunk call. You can see his freaking cards. Obviously, it's obvious when you can see the cards and in hindsight, but I promise you, if you're on the river here in Brian's spot and you're going to say, I'm going to call here and my opponents are bluffing most of the time, it's going to be a losing play long term. Before we get to the results, leave your thoughts in a comment below. How would you play the hand? What are your thoughts on the hand? I'd love to hear from you. Final thoughts. From a math standpoint, I think this is a fold. I think most people are not bluffing here 30% of the time. But like I said before, going back to Bill in the way he called the turn here, it looked kind of weak. Number one, I think he looks kind of weak. He doesn't really look like he has a 5. Number two, a lot of the time on the turn, Bill or other players are going to be raising with a 5 here. So you can discount some of the possibilities of him having a 5 based on his antics and based on the way he played the hand using what I call a hand range funnel, the process of eliminating hands by deductive reasoning. So using those two things, I would think that it's less likely he has a 5, but still, the question in Brian's mind, is he bluffing 30% of the time? Even with those live reads, it's still super hard to call here.
I fold only because I have no more money.
He does fold. And Bill shows him the bluff.
I think he just folded like 10. No, he folded like 10. Bill! You are the man! Bill! I thought Bill for sure have 10 or 5. I think only have
What a bluff.
Good play. Oh my god. Bill! Bill the magic. That was beating hand. That was the most ridiculous bluff I've ever seen.
And so I don't blame Brian for ultimately folding. This was a super sick hand. I hope you enjoyed this hand of the day. Subscribe to the channel. More awesome content's coming. Alec Torelli. See you in the next one.